I'm pleased to be joined by Tanith McCulloch and Stephen Barry as we're going to be exploring the impacts of sibling sexual abuse on the family, the extended family, and the environment within which the family operates. So we're going to dive into the conversation in just a minute, but I'd like to take a moment for each of you to introduce yourselves. So Tanith, I'm going to start with you.
Hello, my name's Tanith McCulloch. I'm a counsellor and supervisor. I work with parents impacted by SSA and couples, and I also work within SARSAS, heading the Adult Survivor Project in Sibling Sexual Abuse.
That's great. Thank you, Tanith. Stephen.
Hi, my name's Stephen Barry. I'm the clinical lead and manager for a service called Be Safe in Bristol, England, and we're part of the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. My background is as a social worker and an integrative psychotherapist, and our service works with children, young people, and parents, carers, and the network supporting the child with his concerns around harmful sexual behaviour, and that will sometimes include sibling sexual abuse.
And it's great to have you both here because this topic that we're really diving into today is very important, and you're both well placed to speak to it given your work experience and background. So, you know, sometimes I play devil's advocate. So the first question I need to ask is going to be a devil's advocate question, which I do sometimes hear from people. Why do we even need to tell society about a topic, sibling sexual abuse, that really should be held in the privacy of one's family, like behind closed doors? So why are we even having the Awareness Day? Why do we even have this conversation? Stephen, I'm going to toss that one to you first.
I mean, one of the stats that's often talked about, and I think it's only become into prominence in the last 2 or 3 years, is that sibling sexual abuse in one study was reported to be 3 times more common than other types of intrafamilial abuse. And often it was abuse between or harmful behaviour between children or under 18s. And I think if we're going to change behaviour, we need to intervene and we need to highlight it. And that behaviour often occurs in secrecy, and there's a lot of shame and stigma associated with that. But we need to name that behaviour to prevent it continuing and to support those who are also harmed.
For sure. But Tanith, do we need to be talking about it in society?
We definitely need to be having these conversations. Society needs to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, and the only way to prevent this is through raising awareness and educating society as a whole.
And following on from other conversations I've had in other content blocks for the Awareness Day, you know, there's a repeated idea that sibling sexual abuse happens in a context, you know, of family dynamics, generally speaking, and other, you know, influences like school and access to, say, pornography or other bits of information, which is a societal impression upon the family, right? It's how society impacts a family. So I think it's only reasonable to say that sibling sexual abuse also impacts society because the family is disrupted. And families, we know in the basics of sociology, I mean, they're an integral part of community and society. So whatever is disrupting the family is ultimately disrupting society. But let's dive into really a little bit more information about, you know, the impacts of sibling sexual abuse, not only on the person who has been harmed, but also the person who caused harm. We can touch on that, but we have spoken about it in other content blocks. But really how it fundamentally shifts the family dynamic and what's going on with the whole family. As one person said, it's like a little bomb goes off in the family, and the family needs to do something with it. So let's jump in then on the idea of the actual types of impact. I'll just quickly do the what we know in research to date, which most people will agree is still somewhat limited. But the person harmed and the person harmed who has harmed often have really negative impacts of the behavior itself: anxiety, depression, addiction issues, teen homelessness, teen suicide, PTSD, complex PTSD, ongoing, potentially lifelong impacts and fears and anxieties that can be re-triggered later in life, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't mean to sound so flippant, but we've in other content blocks gone into that in more detail. But how now is the impact of sibling sexual abuse when there is no disclosure, let's go there, okay? When there's no disclosure, but it's going on, what sort of things do we know or do we believe to be occurring that's impacting the family, even when there's no disclosure? Stephen, you wanna go there first?
I mean, quite obviously, for the child who's been harmed, is the whole impact of secrecy, of shame, of self-blame, trying to maybe avoid situations in the family context. I think about, because when we think about extended families, family gatherings, for example, that they don't want to be at that particular gathering if it's a sibling, or it could also be a cousin or a very close family member who's perceived in a very similar light. And that real lack of confidence, lack of voice, but there might be an internalizing, but there might also be an acting out in terms of rage and anger and emotional dysregulation, and people not recognizing what's going on. So the child who's harmed doesn't feel they can tell anybody because they feel to blame, or they've accepted a bribe, or fearful of the consequences if they tell. So the ripple effects and lots of unknowns and behaviour that get perceived as this child's being naughty, or just keeps to themselves and shuts themselves in their room. So we don't recognise those as potentials. I mean, they could be potential indicators for lots of things, of course, but so they lose their voice actually, and don't feel they can trust people in the family to tell. And if they do tell, will they be believed or dismissed or blamed, or excluded? And I've had cases where young people, children who have been harmed by brothers, for example, have been told if they tell, they're going to be kicked out of the family. So, it's a really all other threats of violence, for example, and so forth. So it's multiple. There's lots of unhiddens. Sorry, there's lots of hiddens, not unhiddens.
Yeah, no, and that's when, the non-disclosure part, as you say, it can be tricky because say, for example, disruptive behavior can be indicative of many things for a child, but we don't think that as parents or as society, we don't think that one of the possibilities might be, either hidden physical abuse by a sibling, which is another topic altogether, but it's that disruption by one sibling to another, or potentially the sibling sexual abuse. We don't, it doesn't hit our radar, does it? That could be why our child is acting out if there's been no disclosure. But Tanith, a quick question for you about what are the impacts to the person causing harm if there's been no disclosure? Are they similar?
They can be, yes, and every case is completely different. So the person causing harm or the abuse has their own shame. They're not processing what is leading up to the behaviour and the contributing factors, whether they need support, whether that's viewing pornography, whether it's social isolation. They themselves have been impacted because the reality is people don't carry out these behaviours. We know our children aren't born that way. Something has to lead up. So in order to support the whole family, it's imperative to see everything as a whole, taking in the environmental, the social, the family dynamics. So the silence trauma thrives in secrecy. So the impact's not only on the children, but the family. It causes attachment issues. I get so many parents holding so much guilt and shame looking back. As Stephen was discussing, there are the impacts that go unnoticed, the dysregulation, and maybe associating it with troubles within school. The child who has been victimized, they are often left to deal with that on their own, and that impacts their core beliefs. They can't trust others, the world, or themselves. That distorts view. And even with the stigma and shame behind all that, even once the behaviour stops, the dynamics and the impact on all family members continue, especially if they hold it into adulthood. And that's where attachment breakdown, that's where sibling sexual abuse is different within the family dynamics and relationships associated with it.
And you bring up a sort of a good point as well, and reinforce a point that we were touching on before, is that this can be lifelong, particularly when there isn't disclosure, but it can be lifelong. And we know, I think, in many forms of sexual abuse, whether it's SSA, other forms of CSA in particular within a family, disclosure doesn't usually happen in youth anyway. It predominantly happens in adulthood. So that, 20 years later sort of thing. And so there's been impacts of the abuse on very important years in a young adult's life, when they're in their 20s and 30s, before they feel maybe they can disclose, if they ever do. And, in the story portal at SiblingsToo.com, for example, I've had people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s tell me that my story portal is the only person they're telling, or maybe their spouse, and that's it. And so the disruption of and the dynamic of the family changes, and people don't always know why, because there isn't clear disclosure. Stephen?
And something you said, I mean, something that reminds me of is that we work with a number of parents, often mums, where they disclose for the first time that they were abused by a sibling because their child's acted out sexually, and that triggers huge fear. And I think that's another reason your question at the beginning about why should society be talking to us, because we need to intervene earlier, and we need to give a message that it is okay to tell, and these are the safe people to tell, because that's how you stop that behavior, or have a greater chance of that behavior stopping. And there are massive impacts on society in terms of, if we just go down to, some people, economists like doing these studies called QALY, so quality of life adjustments. So if we don't intervene, this is going to influence someone's productivity in society, if we want to get that crude. And then they're going to become, and then they may, and I had this conversation with someone the other day about the vast number of women in mental health institutions, inpatient, who've experienced significant abuse, and for some of those it's sexual abuse, because we haven't intervened earlier, because we haven't been willing to have, as Tanith said, those difficult conversations about the unthinkable, the unbearable. So the consequences go on. And as we know, children often don't disclose until adulthood, even if they do disclose at all.
And that's the thing, right? Because the door isn't necessarily open for people, whether they're children or adults, to disclose easily, because of all the societal stigma and the problematic messaging that society has around certain things. And we've touched on that in other content blocks as well, that even, the way that media portrays sexual, not so much sexual violence, but even in television shows, the way that certain dynamics are portrayed make people feel a sense of shame or guilt or something that keeps them quiet. You sort of both use the word secret or secrecy, and that's, we know this across psychology anyway. The more you keep secrets of any kind, the more problematic it becomes for you, the more difficult it is. You don't feel that you can connect to other people because you're holding back those little secrets. So you sort of live this quieter life, as it were. You don't really feel connected to others. Tanith, did you have a further thought on that?
No, I suppose it's just adding to what Stephen's saying, that children do feel safe and supported when disclosing. But I think another key aspect is that we educate children in the consequences of their behavior, rather than just putting it back to the child who has been harmed, that we educate children as a whole. If this behavior were to be carried out, these are the lifelong impacts that your behavior has had. So teaching them that victim empathy and accountability. And this is why we need to have it in relationship and sexual education, and improve society's awareness that this does go on. I think the Freedom of Information piece of research carried out in the previous 2-year study highlighted 24% of all reported cases that happened between children under the age of 18, 24% were sibling. And that is a huge key piece of research. So therefore we need to be having these conversations and not thinking the unthinkable doesn't happen. It is very difficult to wrap your head around, or for society to believe something like this can happen between two children. it's that ick factor, no, that wouldn't happen, or it only happens to families down the road. But if society, teachers, parents, the world as a whole recognize this for what it is, then we can have that early intervention, that preventative aspect.
And it's usually seen that behaviors start between siblings as more innocuous behaviors become more problematic, and then get worse from there. Wrong language, but you know what I mean. They become more aggressive, perhaps, or more harmful as time goes by. So as you sort of mentioned there, if we're aware as a society, for sure, but also within the dynamic of the family, if the more we are aware of these possibilities, the more we can accept these things occurring as a possibility, the more likely it is we can intervene early and prevent it from escalating. So let's look at the dynamic of the family, how it gets disrupted when there is disclosure. And, I'm always just how people make decisions fascinates me. I know enough about psychology to know that I'm really interested about that, but not enough to know how to, make complete sense of it. So, but the idea of the influence of society on a family's decision-making process when it comes to sibling sexual abuse, like we've touched on it a couple of times, the shame, the guilt, and the stigma. How does stigma impact the decision-making of parents, but also how they feel in terms of things like their own confidence, self-esteem, parenting skills, and all of these sorts of things? So what does that influence society has on the adult individuals in the family? Stephen, you want to jump in on that one first?
I mean, that term mother blame comes to mind. Actually, I've heard mothers say it was my fault. If I hadn't, why didn't I pick that up? I thought something was strange there, etc., etc. And then you get the guilt associated with that. And then sometimes because we blame ourselves, we are then invited to shut down, maybe deny initially. And for some people, that denial shifts, and for others, it becomes quite stuck or minimized. And I think when we run parent groups and carer groups, I've heard parents talk about how isolated they feel. Who can they tell? They can't even tell their friends. They can't tell someone in their family because of how they're worried how they're going to respond. Are they going to see them as a bad mum or a bad dad? So that really closes that parent down. And then if we think about that, how can that parent then be available for their child who's struggling, if it's the child who's harmed or the child who's been harmed, or support the other siblings and create an acceptable narrative, if you like, or understanding for others in the family if they're struggling themselves. So it's really important we put those supports in place when we think about those, if you like, ripple effects. But for me, it's that idea of isolation. I'm on my own here. It's my fault. I should have done something. I saw something, but I didn't really think anything of it. And I think there's also a taboo in society about thinking about children as sexual beings, seeing their growth and their sexual development as just part of being children. And how do you divert age-appropriate sexual behaviour that might be inappropriate and not ignore it, because as parents we might feel uncomfortable having those conversations with our children. In society, there's lots of value clashes and beliefs about what's okay to talk about in school, for example. But we really need to be having these conversations, not to say, anything goes, but to make informed choices and understand what's okay and what's not okay in terms of appropriate development.
It's interesting because in another conversation, somebody was sort of saying, if we put the word child and sex into the same sentence, people lose their minds. It's just like, oh no, not going to talk about that, because we struggle to see small humans as sexual beings. They're these innocent little bundles of atoms and neurons and stuff, and there's no way they can be sexual beings before like maybe 16. That's a false narrative for sure. Tanith, what do you think is what we're sort of talking about here is the bottom up and top down perfect storm that parents get into because they've got to deal internally within the family, or they've just found out or discovered that there's this abusive behavior going on involving siblings. They may have other children that they need to deal with as well. So their attention is directed that way. But then they also have in the back of the head that sort of what we were just talking about, the dynamic of stigma from society sort of crushing down from the top, and all the confusion and anguish pushing up from the bottom. So what's happening to a parent right there?
I think another key part that we need to focus on is the fear, that is created within society, and more so the fear of social services. That in itself, for social services to be involved in a family, many people feel very shameful, although they're there to support family members. So for parents, quite often, what I hear them report is it's not about the behavior. It's okay, how do I prevent social services coming in and ripping our family apart, because they go to the worst case scenario. So their whole decision making is based and operated through fear. And that's part of the minimization and the denial process they may go through. If you're talking about from the bottom up, having to hold so many conflicting emotions, I hear from parents, and although they are a family unit, the mother and the father may disagree on how to go about handling the situation. The emotions differ, although the context is the same, the emotional responses differ. So quite often it's helping parents process all that and go through that. And because there is such a lack of resource or conversation or awareness, as Stephen said, it's that feeling of isolation. Who do I go to? And sometimes avoidance is their only key method to minimize and deal with those conflicting emotions and the overwhelm. And that's another thing that also impacts, although disclosure may or may not come, it's what impacts it has on the parents. We recognize parents are the key in helping the children grow from this and heal and develop and go into, if you can use the word, functional adults. But in order to minimize the impacts, parents are a key part in that. So if a parent, for example, is experiencing their own mental health difficulties or depression as a result of the disclosure, and heaven forbid other ACEs are thrown in, then that also compounds the impacts for the children involved, because then they're suffering more adverse childhood experiences on top of it. So you're opening a huge can of worms, but it's not just one issue. It is one thing that leads on to another, to another.
Stephen, you have a thought?
Pick up something that Tanith has said. I mean, I'm just mindful of a study that someone that used to work at BSAFE did of 6 parents about their responses and the impacts on them as parents of young people who had harmed sexually. And it was a small study, but there were themes that we've already talked about being overwhelmed, shock, distress, anger, disgust, memories being re-triggered, guilt, shame. So all the things we're talking about here, and that wanting distance from the child who's harmed as well, and then feeling bad about that, and this push-pull between the needs of the 2 children, and then not knowing who to talk to in the family. If I talk to my mum, she's going to tell me I'm a bad parent. And then it starts to re-trigger their own family dynamics in terms of their own family of origin. So it becomes multi-layered and multi-complex. And this sense of needing to preserve yourself because you're feeling under threat. And I often talk about this notion of a grief process. When you hear something that's overwhelming, that's unbelievable, is beyond what you'd ever imagined, of course you're going to have a grief, actually. You're going to deny, you're going to get angry, you're going to accept, you're going to go back to being angry, back to denying, and feeling overwhelmed. So having a space where it's okay to have those feelings and process those as a parent, but other family members and extended family may have those as well. So it's thinking about that whole ripple effects and how this behavior, when it comes out, can split families. I know of families who have had close relationships with, a brother, so the uncle to the children, or auntie to the children, and then they don't have contact after what's happened.
Yeah, so let's go into,
and there's massive loss with that.
There is, and let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think we don't take all of that into consideration enough. Because I know, usually in a family, you know, you're a parent and you hang out with your friends who are also parents, and you talk about stuff that's going on, and, oh, I've got this problem with such and such with so and so in school. How might you handle it? You know, you have these back and forth in when you're trying to problem solve something in your family, and whether that's women in particular have their mom groups or their buddies and these sorts of things, but dads do as well, and they talk about stuff. Or as you say, Stephen, you know, they go to their parent or they go to another family member and ask. But my understanding is that that's really, as you were saying, not likely to happen, or highly diminished, based on the family of origin dynamics, and that thing of, you can have a bestie friend and you say something to them and they may not know how to handle this, and you know, it's instantly that, what do you, maybe a person feels like, oh, as you say, I must be doing something wrong as a parent, and that's how another person's going to think about me as well, that I let this happen in my family, and that's what we think. So that isolation piece. So, but sometimes the extended family is also very supportive, and you can get help. Maybe not all the extended family, maybe not everybody, but there are a few people that will show up for you, you know, and all that. But what happens to that extended family as well? How did, even sort of lifelong and into adulthood, if we go back to the idea that many survivors don't disclose until adulthood, and then all of a sudden a bomb's gone into a family of adults and things get really disruptive. What have you seen in your professional practice about those sorts of things?
Well, I suppose for me, I have seen both early disclosure and disclosure into adulthood, and quite often extended family members, grandparents, play a key role in that. Grandparents may be seen as kinship carers during when disclosure is in childhood, so therefore they adopt a huge responsibility in caring for whichever child is separated, usually the child carrying out the harm. And that can create a divide, but it also can create a sense of support. So I know of two families who have had different situations in response to that. It has solidified, and again, it goes back to nuclear families, whether they're blended families, the whole context has to be taken into consideration. Are they older grandparents? Are there cultural norms and societal views that kids will be kids? Or, oh, I'm 100% behind everything, we need to get support for everyone. So it can be hugely conflicting. And I think that's why it's important that families work together and establish ground rules for all and come together as an agreement. This is the best way we can support both the children, because if there is a divide, then again, that impacts other people. That impacts the siblings that haven't been harmed. It impacts marriage, their relationships with their in-laws, or even their own paternal parent. It's so multifaceted, and every situation is unique and different. But Stephen, I'm sure you've seen different situations.
Yeah, I mean, just you talking to us makes me think about the different responses from families, actually. So for one family, an aunt was offering the care to the child, and then she was ostracized by the rest of the family because she dared to take this child in. Another family all came together and supported that family and had one of the children, because that was the best arrangement for two children to be separate. And they worked together. Think about a family where a child was with a grandparent, and then the plan was reunification with mum. And we worked with both mum and grandparent and the children. And they worked together really well, but there's some really painful conversations in that process. So there's lots of possibilities, and you'll get different responses from different members of the family. Dad's side of the family might be very supportive and responsive, and mum's not, and vice versa. Or an uncle or an aunt might be highly critical. Or actually, you might have worries about that uncle or aunt in terms of their own harmful or sexually abusive behaviour. So, as Tanith referred to ACEs, so adverse childhood experience are not uncommon in the lives of many of the children our service works with, but that's not saying it's only those families where sibling sexual abuse happens, because it's not. It's much broader than that. But so you need to think about all those more complicated dynamics. But there's lots of variations, and I think Tanith may have referred to, you know, different beliefs in terms of cultures and faiths and family arrangements, and you know, who's the main carer of the family may not be mum and dad. It might be an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent. And also I think about this idea of, if the children go after school to grandma, is grandma on board with the safety plan and supervision arrangements? And if they're going to be on board, what are you willing as mum or dad to tell them? And then we work with children who are also in care, so foster care, residential care, and other placements. So let's think about all of those kind of things as well.
It's sounding like super complex and very dynamic, and a moving thing. You know, there's no one size fits all, there's no answer, and it sounds really overwhelming. And I think part of this conversation is it's a super important conversation, but it might be adding to that fear of reaching out for help, because then it's like, oh my God, this could get really complex. But we also know that when it is possible to reach out for help, when families feel they can get help and they do get help, there is solutions. There's a way forward becomes possible, because although research in sibling sexual abuse is limited, and we know that to be true generally, we do know that if nothing is done, or it's just dismissed, that's quite negatively impactful for life. You know, it can really have all sorts of layers of harm throughout someone's life, whether that is the person who caused harm, the one who was harmed, or other siblings. So being able to reach out for help is super important. So when families do reach out for help, what sort of things, other than you've talked about some cases that you work with and how you might support a family through a particular process, but for example, Stephen, the notion of restorative practice, for example, how does that play into supporting families moving forward to a more positive outcome than what we sound like we're talking about, which really just sounds really negative and frightening, and you know, very scary for everybody. So what are the pathways that families might take in terms of moving forward from sibling sexual abuse?
So the idea for me of restorative practice sits alongside restorative justice, but it's also different, because I think it's about an approach that informs your thinking, that thinks about the whole system, the whole family, and that can be the extended family as well. So it thinks about the multiple impacts, but also thinks about the multiple possibilities for healing, but doing that in a very guided, very slow way that balances, and it is complex, the needs of different people who have different needs quite clearly, and impacted in very different ways and respond in very different ways. So it's how, as professionals, because that's where I'm coming from in this conversation, is about how we get alongside families and the different members of the family to give them a voice about what pathway do they want to follow, what feels safe. And for me, it needs to be very much led by the victim, the child that's harmed, giving them a voice in that process. And you know, we've got examples of where we're told sometimes the child who's been harmed wants this reconciliation, if you like, and we're not too sure about that. So in more recent years, we've started to say, actually, if that child's willing to meet with one of our team, we'll have that conversation ourselves and just check that out. And sometimes that it comes up to scrutiny, and that's what they want, and we can agree a safe process to do that. And other kinds, it doesn't work that way, and they say, no, there's no way I want that contact. So it's being open to the different possibilities. And there's something about a multi-agency approach, which is really important. So if I think about a sibling case that was very complex, very worrying, the child was placed in a kinship care placement, who had harmed, the other children remained with their parent, and we had to think with the social worker alongside the agency offering the support and counselling to the children who'd been harmed in our service about how we approach contact, reintroducing contact in a very slow way. But that's balancing out all the different needs and coming up with a shared narrative and understanding of what's happened. That's not always possible, and you sometimes have you have to hold that there will be different perspectives and views, but you need to, the bottom line, is this safe? Is this in the child's interest? Is it more or less harmful to follow these processes? So there are possibilities, and I think for families, sometimes there must be a real fear, and I understand that they lose control, that they're going to be judged by the authorities, not only judged by their own families, but judged by the authorities, and that when you become involved with child protection, police, it's really scary. And some of those processes, let's be honest about it, are not very child friendly, are they? Despite efforts and intentions, you lose control at that point, and that's what we don't want to happen. And we work in our service in a way, an example would be when we write an assessment report, we don't share that before we share it with the parents and carers and get some agreement. We might agree to disagree, but that'll be noted in the report. That can take a long time. It can be a toing and throwing process. Someone just brought that to me the other day. Two parents have different views. So how do we reconcile those in a report? Maybe we don't. Maybe we just have to note those. But as long as they're feeling their voice is being heard, because they have an experience where someone writes a report, sends it off to a social worker or the court, and they're done to. So we need to avoid that process. How do we encourage collaboration? And that also, for me, is about restorative practice as well.
And Tanith, what are your thoughts on that?
I think Stephen makes a very valid point that it is about collaboration and cohesion and working together, and that parents or whoever the family members are involved, that they feel like they are working in partnership for the benefits of the children. Because I hear so many parents say they feel so disempowered and out of control, but yet the minute that disclosure is there, although it's a grenade going off, there is a pathway, there are resources and information out there, and that is hugely relieving for a lot of people. To be able to know these are the services with the early intervention, they can get support as a family. Yes, it is going to be a rocky road, but for families that try to do this on their own, that fear of disclosure, that fear of impacts of the family secret coming out, that lives on. So therefore the dynamics continue to live on, and the impact that has for the child who has been abused, it dysregulates the whole family and there's no coming back from it. So it is with anything, anxiety is the fear of not being in control. But the minute you tackle the issue and the minute that people work together and the agencies all come together and very much giving the child a voice. I have one family and it's beautiful to watch because they are so open and honest with the child who has been victimized. And family members are saying, why would you talk so openly to her? And the parents' response, and it's beautiful, was just that actually this is her process and I can't let her think for herself and come up with her own conclusions. And that in itself was so empowering for the child, because it's not as if, okay, it's been done, this is it, let's put a lid on it. So that child is very much involved, and the fact that her voice has been heard from such an early age, it will significantly reduce the long-term impacts, and the more that conversations are had, the more planning. I actually see so many success stories now and parents coming together rather than disengaging and separating. And that's only through working partnerships and collaboration and being open and honest with one another. Like as Stephen said, agreeing to disagree, that's okay. People's responses will differ, but as long as they're validated and heard and feel supported, that's the key in the pathway to healing. And if parents can mirror that for their children, then the child is being given a voice, and that will hugely minimize the complex PTSD and all the long-term impacts.
And those are amazing stories too, and they indicate the important role that services can play in helping a family move forward and helping the individuals within the family move forward. But I think you'll both agree that in most jurisdictions, you guys are in the UK, I'm in Canada, but in in most jurisdictions, there's a lack of research, there's a lack of funding, there's a lack of support services. And I think you may also agree that part of the reasoning for that is because there's no real political will to create a change. There's no additional money put forward to services. It's all being held back, and political will it comes when society gets pissed off about a subject and they say to their, municipalities, their governments, whatever, we want this thing to change. And then, oh, look, we find money and things start to change. Wow, what a surprise. So let's wave the magic wand as we sort of wrap up. And let's imagine 3 years, 5 years down the road, we're having a conversation on the Awareness Day in 2028 or 2029, something like that. And we're able to say that stigma has been reduced because society has changed its mind. How do you think, if people listening today think to themselves, I'm actually going to, even though I don't think this has happened in my family, even as an adult, I know this hasn't happened in my family or whatever, but I'm going to investigate. I'm going to look at this further, and maybe this is something I can get behind, these sorts of changes, because it's impacting my communities. What do you want that person, what do you want to say to that person to motivate them to potentially look at the stigma they hold, not only about talking about sex generally or, these sorts of things, but something so taboo as sibling sexual abuse? How can we reduce the stigma, even say 5% in the next 10 years? And Tanith, I'm going to throw that one to you as we begin to wrap up the call. You're welcome.
Thanks for that. I think it's just acknowledging and being comfortable with the uncomfortable situations and conversations. As society continues to move on, and we are tackling controversial issues and being more open and accepting and willing to hear people's experiences from their perspective. So it is, talk to your children about it, talk to schools, allow this conversation to be had. We are seeing so many things come up in the coming months and years with media, with everything. It's not normalizing sibling sexual behavior because we don't want it ever to be normalized, but it's normalizing people's awareness to actually it does happen. And these are the impacts, and these are the preventative measures we can take as a society, by educating, by listening, by responding, by having the conversation.
I think that's great. And the idea of normalizing the conversation, not the behavior, because some people think, oh, if we're talking about it, it gives people permission to go do it. Well, we didn't see that in the church when abuse came out from the church. And now, sports teams and the Me Too movement and things like that, those things normalize the conversation, which help to create change. And Stephen, your last thought on our conversation today?
I'm thinking there are so many influences on our children today that weren't there 2 decades ago in terms of social media, the internet. It's not getting into blame, but it's unfiltered now, isn't it? They have something they call the watershed hour in the UK for TV at 9, but considering you can watch any TV program any time of day or night now, that's a bit of a nonsense, actually. So as parents, as communities, we need to be educated in how some of those things, but also things within the home and outside the home, influence our children. So we need to be having these conversations so they can engage in the positiveness of those media, but also be aware of the risks and how they influence children's behavior. Because some of that influence, as I said, will come from within the family, but some of it will come from outside the family, and children not having the capacity or understanding to know right from wrong. So we need to have these conversations if we're going to create that change and create safer communities, actually, safer families, safer communities. And we've very much talked about this in terms of the need for a public health approach. If we go back to what I said at the beginning, that there are reports to suggest that sibling sexual abuse is 3 times more common than other types of intrafamilial abuse. Doesn't that make it a pandemic? Sexual abuse is a pandemic in terms of the numbers, and why aren't we addressing it in the same way we do pandemics as a massive public health issue? So that's most probably where I'd want to end. So we need to have that conversation and make it safe for our children to have that conversation.
And I'd 100% agree with the idea of approaching it from that public health perspective and considering it a pandemic and a priority public health matter. And I think that is the question that I would want the audience to think about as we sort of wrap up and to take away from this conversation is, how do I get more educated? How do I engage more? Because we really are talking about something that impacts every community, every culture, every continent, and we're not talking about it. So how do I want to be a part of that solution going forward is what I would want the audience to be taking away from our call today. So I know we need to wrap up, and I know I could carry on this conversation because it's a super important conversation, particularly, helping, in the other words that you guys have said, and I've said in this conversation, the terms engagement and education are fundamental to creating the solutions and the potential pathways of intervention and things like that. So I want to thank you both for your time today. I really do appreciate giving of your energy and your enthusiasm to be a part of these types of conversations and to support families and the community as a whole. So thank you both so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.